Thank you everyone for joining our relative webinar. The title of today's webinar is Getting America Back in the Game, a Multilateral Perspective. Today we have very distinguished guests, Professor Richard Baldwin and Professor Andre Sapir. Professor Baldwin is a professor at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Previously, he was president of CEPR, Center for Economic Policy Research, based in London. And he was visiting professor at the MIT. Before moving to Switzerland, Professor Baldwin served as a senior staff economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisor in the Bush White House. He did his PhD in economics at the MIT. So Richard, thank you very much for joining us. So Richard, could you start your presentation?
Okay, so let me start by thanking Reigniting once more for inviting me to share these ideas with an audience which I find to be very useful and influential in Tokyo. The project I'm going to talk about is a joint work between myself, Chad Bowen of the Peterson Institute, John Frade, who used to be the Canadian WTO ambassador, Annabelle Gonzalez, who used to be the trade minister for Costa Rica, Andre Sapir, who you've heard introduced, and Tetsui Watanabe. Something like a microcosm of the G7, missing a few pieces, but hopefully a multilateral. And this project is thinking ahead on cooperation in international trade, or TACIT. And the little document which I want to introduce, and Andre and Tetsui are also co-authors on, is called Getting America Back in the Game, a Multilateral Perspective. Now I'm just going to introduce the idea, the motivation, the idea very quickly, so we can leave lots of time for Q&A, because of course that's the key issue. Everybody has lots of questions about this, and I think we have some answers, but let me introduce the sort of main idea. The open rules-based multilateral trading system was wonderful. It did amazing things in the post-war period. It allowed prosperity, it allowed world poverty to fall, it allowed the emerging markets to rise without leading to major issues. But now it's broken, and Trump broke it. Right up until December 2017, the world trading system was making progress. For example, at the Buenos Aires WTO Ministerial, which launched a number of useful plurilateral discussions, and the Declaration on Women in Trade. But starting from February 2018, the Trump administration started a war on trade, putting tariffs on allies, putting on many products on many different countries. And those countries retaliated. And later on in the Trump administration, it turned to a forceful US-China trade war, which actually accelerated during the presidential campaign to involve all sorts of things that were damaging to any kind of trust or belief that an open rules-based system could work. The election of Biden, of course, opens up a window of opportunity, but this is fragile and complex. And I meant to say is that fixing multilateralism requires getting the US back into the game. It's not the only thing that has to happen, but unless we get the US back in the game, we are not going to be able to restore trust on an open rules-based system. Now, let me hasten to say that we really do need multilateral cooperation right now. There are two era-defining reasons for this in 2021. First of all, we need the trade system and multilateral trust and cooperation to fight the pandemic. Because the pandemic will not be crushed anywhere until it's crushed everywhere. All you have to do is look at a country like New Zealand, who's had an excellent domestic policy, but they keep getting reinfected from abroad. And until the world has put this crisis, this disease down everywhere, all the countries will be continually reinfected, and it may become endemic, which means it's a continual problem. The second one is fighting the global recession. This global recession has been incredibly deep, incredibly broad, and incredibly synchronized. And although most of fighting a recession requires changes in domestic policy, there are elements of international cooperation that can make it better or make it easier. So for these reasons, it's really a pressing matter that we get America back in the game and we get trust and restore movement in international economic cooperation. Now, Biden's constraints are deep and real. Decades of globalization were great for the US as a whole, but created winners and losers. As Pascal Lamy said it so eloquently, trade works because it's painful, and it's painful because it works. That is, trade leads to a reallocation of resources within countries that leads to a more efficient economy as a whole, but creates winners and losers. And the lack of systemic domestic policy to help losers in the US adjust created deep resentment in the US working class voters. Now, both automation and globalization were at fault, but trade is easier to blame than robots. So in the US, there has been a consensus that emerged that globalization is a problem. Moreover, Trump's incessant attacks on multilateralism, trade, and foreigners created a new rallying point for US politics that is now bipartisan and deeply held. It's important to understand how real this reality really is. I was trying to get one more real in there, but I couldn't manage. I thought 4 was already pretty good. Here's just one chart. You can see Brookings has produced a whole thing on the deaths of despair that document the malaise in the US working class and what's the basis of it. But this is one of my favorite. It shows the US income growth relative to other countries. It looks at the real median hourly wage since 1970. And in this measure, you can see that in the US, it has been flat since 1970. And in particular, more or less flat since 1990. And this isn't an issue of Republicans or Democrats. You cannot see any administrations in this. So if you're at the middle of the income working scale in the United States, you do not think things are working. The UK is a little bit better, but if you go to, say, France and Japan and many other G7 countries, it is not at all the case that there's been a relatively widespread sharing of the prosperity. Now, this Biden's reluctance on trade, I want to spend one more minute on it because it is the basis, the ground foundation of the problems we have to solve. Biden said in a speech in July 2020, there's no going back to business as usual on trade. We need new rules, new processes that has voices for all stakeholders at the table, including leaders of representing labor and the environment. So the whole Biden project is to fix US domestic economic problems first. And once American workers are competitive enough to stand up to anybody, then perhaps we'll return to opening up to trade. That's the plan on the economics now, according to Biden. But then we can ask, can the world wait? And I would simply point out that Obama faced very similar constraints to Biden, and he waited for 4 years to do anything on trade. So my answer, or our answer is no, the world faces two era-defining challenges in 2021 that I mentioned, fighting the global pandemic, fighting the recession. We can't wait. Now, Biden's foreign and climate policies are announced in a very, very different feeling. The key goal is to restore American leadership abroad, foreign policy based on American values, climate policy based on science. And Biden's plan, which is on the internet, and he said in speeches, and his advisor, his designate for the Secretary of State, for example, says that America includes a blueprint to repair the damage wrought by President Trump and chart a fundamentally different course for American foreign policy for the world as we find it today and anticipate it for tomorrow. Now, we were all hoping it would be trade, not foreign policy, but for Biden, it's foreign policy. There is Oval Office level attention on fixing the problems that Trump caused in foreign policy, and a very similar thing on climate. This is a window of opportunity. Because Biden must address trade issues to achieve his foreign policy and climate goals. The 2 points here are that he must remove the Trump damage to trade in order to restore trust. For example, when he told NATO allies that their steel exports were a threat to American national security, that was somewhere between a joke and an insult. But in any case, we can't get back to the old ways on foreign policy until that kind of damage is removed. Threats of tariffs against German cars or threats of removing troops from Germany, those sorts of random, feckless thoughts destroy trust, and they must be removed if we're going to move forward. Second, he'll find it convenient to use trade as part of the deals, compromise, and packages with like-minded nations. So it's both a carrot and a stick. Trade will be part of Biden's foreign policy and climate policy. And that's an opportunity for people who care about trade. So the plan we've developed here, and we've talked to lots of people who are very close to governments on what's possible, what's not. But this is kind of an idea to provoke your thinking, to change a mindset. The 2 elements are, first of all, work together in addressing the United States, not just bilaterally. And second, design mutually advantageous trade tracks that fit into Biden's foreign policy and climate goals while simultaneously restoring multilateral economic cooperation, starting slowly, hopefully creating a snowball effect. Now, what do we mean by working together? The group needs to be small, representative, and homogeneous enough to agree rapidly. Who's actually in it? That's an intensely political discussion, which people like us aren't very well adapted to solving. So we've just given some criteria. The group needs to be fully transparent with the rest of the world. It needs to operate in an informal and institutionalist setting so it can be flexible. Now, of course, there are many, many examples of this in history. At the WTO, for example, it's sometimes called the green room process. But in many, many situations, you get a group of people to try and hash out the key trade-offs and then try and bring everybody else along. Now, Biden also recognizes the need to work together. And this next slide, I want to show the reality of it. If we look at the reality of world trade shares when Clinton took office, China had 1% and the US had 13%. EU was 37, Japan was 7, Canada was 3. So if you took the G7, roughly speaking, it was about 2/3 of world trade. When Biden's taking office, China is 10 times larger. The United States isn't much smaller, but Japan is 3%, Canada is 2%. And if you take the G7 together, it's less than half. And there's one country, a single political actor, who's gone from 1% to 10%, almost as large as the United States if you take imports and exports. And that changes the reality. It means the United States can no longer go it alone. Trump found that going along. I'm going to end right away here. Sorry, Tetsui, I'm taking too long. Just to give you some examples of trade tracks, what we're talking about. Day one in Biden, they've already said they're going to join the Paris Agreement, join the WTO, call for a NATO summit. And we could also say, remove the US bloc on the new Director General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, where there's a consensus except one. That could be the trade track in the day one agenda. For the first 100 days, US administrations often think about first 100 days, they're planning to repair the alliance. And you could include removing the national security tariffs, removing the threats, removing low quality trade deals that were struck. In leading the global fight against pandemic, most of it will be domestic. A lot of it will be at the WTO and scientific. But for instance, there could be a truce at the WTO on trade and medical products where there's no tariffs, but no restrictions, for example. Leading climate, mostly that's going to be about carbon. It's going to be about science. It's going to be about committing to changing the way economies run. But we could finish the fish subsidies at the WTO, and we could finish the environmental goods agreement as a trade track in the climate leadership. And leading the fight against global recession, Most of that's going to be cooperating as they always do, but it could involve a G20 commitment to no protection to start boosting uncertainty start boosting uncertainty by creating deliberations on WTO reform and addressing the China interface problem, just as was done after. So that I went on a little bit too long and maybe I rushed through it, but the idea here is that like-minded nations should change the mindset. A bilateral approach to the US is less likely to work, where each and every country asks for what they want from the Biden administration, and the Biden administration says, okay, fine, but not in the first term. Working together with the US to crack trade tracks, which are mutually advantaged, restore international economic cooperation, and help tackle the global pandemic and the global recession, that could work. Maybe Japan could take the lead. So I'll end with that. And just to say that this is not anti-China. Trump created an atmosphere of hostility, distrust, and acrimony. This toxic environment stands in the way of adapting economic cooperation among all nations to the economic political realities of the 21st century. And China is and will be part of that reality. Thinking back to the US-Japan conflicts of the 1980s, America had to be in the game of thinking multilateral cooperation was good before it could fix the problem with Japan, before we could get back to the wave. So let me just end right there. Thank you for listening. And sorry, I went on a little bit too long.
Thank you, Richard, for your presentation. And the basic idea is to get the US back to the international game. On the trade policy in particular, we need to think through how we can fit the trade policy in the way of a foreign policy track and climate policy track. That's the basic message from the group. Thank you very much for your presentation.